Paris, 1949. The literary salons fall silent as a woman's voice cuts through centuries of masculine discourse like a blade through silk. Her name is Simone de Beauvoir, and she has just published words that will shatter the very foundations of how society sees women. But what happens when a woman refuses to be anyone's second sex? What breaks inside the men who expected her submission? Today, we uncover the devastating truth about how powerful men crumbled when faced with a woman who would bow to no one. This is not just a story about feminism. This is a story about what happens when the comfortable lies men tell themselves about women are torn away, leaving them naked and vulnerable before a truth they cannot handle. Chapter 1. The Awakening of Rebellion. Born into the suffocating elegance of bourgeois Paris in 1908, Simone de Beauvoir was destined to become someone's perfect wife, someone's devoted daughter, someone's silent companion. Her father, Georges, looked at his brilliant daughter and saw only a future ornament for another man's life. But Simone had other plans. At the Sorbonne, while her male classmates expected intellectual submission wrapped in feminine charm, Simone delivered something entirely different. Her philosophy professor, Jean Baruzzi, would later admit that her questions left him sleepless, not from admiration, but from a disturbing realization that this young woman possessed an intellect that threatened the very order he represented. During one particularly heated debate about women's nature, a male classmate confidently declared that women were naturally suited for domestic life. Simone stood up, her voice cutting through the classroom like winter wind through weak glass. Her response was so devastating, so intellectually superior, that the young man reportedly left the university the following semester. What had she done? She had refused to play the role of the grateful student learning from her intellectual superiors. She had claimed her space as an equal, and in doing so, she had broken something fundamental inside a young man who had never imagined a woman could outthink him. This was just the beginning. Every man who encountered Simone expected her to shrink herself to fit their comfort zone. Instead, she expanded, taking up intellectual space that they believed belonged exclusively to them. The pattern was always the same: first confusion, then anger, then a desperate attempt to put her back in her place. But Simone de Beauvoir would never again fit into anyone else's definition of who she should be. Chapter 2. The Man Who Trembled Before Her. Enter Jean-Paul Sartre, the brilliant philosopher who would become both her greatest intellectual companion and her most complex emotional challenge. When they met at École Normale Supérieure in 1929, Sartre was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. He had built his identity around his intellectual superiority, particularly over women who, in his experience, offered admiration rather than challenge. But Simone was different. During their first philosophical discussion, she not only matched his arguments, but exceeded them, pushing his ideas into territories he had never explored. For the first time in his life, Sartre found himself intellectually outmaneuvered by a woman. The experience was both thrilling and terrifying. Their relationship began with a pact that would scandalize Paris society. They would be intellectual equals, emotional partners, but never bound by the traditional chains of marriage. Simone had made it clear that she would never be anyone's wife in the conventional sense. She would not sacrifice her ambitions for his comfort, would not silence her voice for his ego, would not become the supportive shadow behind his success. This arrangement broke something inside Sartre that he spent the rest of his life trying to repair. Friends noticed how he would become agitated when Simone disagreed with him in public, how his hands would shake slightly when she corrected his philosophical positions during debates. The man who prided himself on emotional detachment found himself dependent on a woman who refused to be dependent on him. Years later, Sartre would confess to friends that loving Simone was like trying to possess a hurricane. Every time he thought he understood her, she evolved beyond his comprehension. Every time he expected her to need him, she demonstrated her complete autonomy. This was not the kind of love he had been taught to expect from women, and it left him perpetually off balance, always struggling to redefine himself in relation to someone who refused to be defined by him. What do you think about this dynamic? Have you ever seen how a man reacts when a woman refuses to play the traditional role he expects? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Chapter 3: When Love Becomes Obsession. But Sartre was not the only man whose world was shattered by Simone's refusal to be anyone's second sex. Her impact on other men was often more dramatic, more desperate, and sometimes dangerous. Take the case of André Malraux, the celebrated writer and future French Minister of Culture. When he first encountered Simone at a literary salon in 1945, he was immediately captivated by her intelligence and beauty. However, Malraux expected what every successful man of his generation expected, that his charm, fame, and power would eventually make her surrender her independence for the privilege of being associated with him. Simone's polite but firm rejection of his advances sent Malraux into what friends described as a months-long spiral of obsession. He wrote her letters that became increasingly desperate, increasingly angry. In one particularly revealing letter, discovered years later, Malraux wrote, "You think you can exist without needing a man's protection, but you are wrong. Your independence is an illusion that will destroy you." The irony was palpable. Here was a man who had written extensively about human freedom and dignity, yet he could not accept that a woman might choose to exercise that very freedom in relation to him. When Simone continued to decline his advances, Malraux began what can only be described as a campaign of intellectual sabotage. He used his influence to have her excluded from certain literary events, spread rumors about her relationship with Sartre, and even attempted to convince publishers that her work was derivative of male philosophers. But perhaps the most disturbing case was that of Michel Leiris, the anthropologist and writer who became so obsessed with possessing Simone intellectually and emotionally that he began stalking her. He would appear at cafes where she worked, follow her through the streets of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and show up uninvited at her apartment. When confronted, Leiris would break down, sobbing that he couldn't understand how a woman could be so complete without needing a man to complete her. These men had built their identities around being needed by women, around being the center of feminine attention and devotion. Simone's self-sufficiency exposed the emptiness of that identity, revealing that their sense of masculine power was built on feminine dependence. When that dependence was removed, they collapsed. Thank you for staying with us this far. The revelations ahead will show you just how far some men were willing to go to destroy a woman who refused to be destroyed by them. The most shocking part of this story is yet to come. Chapter 4: The Revenge of Wounded Egos. When The Second Sex was published in 1949, the reaction from the male-dominated literary and academic establishments was swift and vicious. This was not mere criticism. This was war against a woman who had dared to expose the mechanisms by which men had maintained their dominance over women for centuries. The Catholic Church immediately banned the book, with Cardinal Felton declaring it a work of dangerous perversity that threatens the foundation of Christian family. But the religious condemnation was mild compared to the fury unleashed by male intellectuals who saw their comfortable worldview being systematically demolished. François Mauriac, the Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote a scathing review in which he attacked not just Simone's ideas, but her right to have ideas at all. He suggested that her philosophical work was merely the frustrated writings of a woman who had failed to find fulfillment in her natural role. When Simone responded with a devastating counter-argument that exposed the logical fallacies in his position, Mauriac reportedly threw the newspaper across his study and refused to discuss her work ever again. More sinister was the campaign orchestrated by Albert Camus, who had once been a friend and intellectual peer. When Simone's book began gaining international recognition, threatening to overshadow his own philosophical work, Camus began what can only be described as a systematic attempt to undermine her credibility. He spread rumors in intellectual circles that she was merely Sartre's mouthpiece, that her ideas were stolen from male philosophers, that her success was due to her sexuality rather than her intellect. The most devastating attack came from Claude Lévi-Strauss, the renowned anthropologist, who published a scholarly article that was ostensibly a critique of her anthropological evidence, but was actually a thinly veiled character assassination. He suggested that a woman could not possibly understand the objective nature of human societies because she was too emotionally invested in changing them. What these men could not tolerate was that Simone had not just succeeded in a man's world, she had redefined that world entirely. She had taken the tools of philosophy, psychology, and anthropology that men had used to justify women's subordination and turned them into weapons of liberation. In doing so, she had revealed that much of what these men called objective truth was actually elaborate justification for their own privilege. The attacks were relentless, but they also revealed something crucial. These men were not arguing with Simone's ideas because they disagreed with them intellectually. They were fighting for their psychological survival against a woman who had exposed the lie at the heart of their identity. Chapter 5: The Price of Freedom. By 1955, Simone de Beauvoir had achieved what no woman of her generation had managed: complete intellectual and personal independence. She had refused to be anyone's second sex, and she had paid a price that few people truly understood. The isolation was profound. While men feared her strength, many women resented her choices. She received hate mail from wives who accused her of destroying their marriages by giving their husbands dangerous ideas about women's capabilities. She was excluded from social circles where her presence made both men and women uncomfortable with their own compromises. But perhaps the most devastating cost was what happened to the men who had loved her. Sartre, despite their enduring partnership, never fully recovered from loving a woman he could not possess or define. His later relationships were marked by an increasingly desperate need to find women who would need him in ways that Simone never did. Friends observed that he seemed to be constantly trying to prove his masculinity to himself through conquest and control. The other men who had encountered her authentic power carried their wounds for decades. Malraux never married, spending his life pursuing unavailable women who reminded him of the independence he had found so threatening in Simone. Laris wrote obsessively about her in his private journals until his death, never able to understand why a woman would choose autonomy over his devotion. Yet Simone persevered, and in doing so, she created a template for every woman who would come after her. She proved that a woman could refuse to be anyone's second sex and survive the consequences. More than survive, she could thrive, create, influence, and change the world. The men who broke under the pressure of her independence revealed something fundamental about the fragility of traditional masculinity. When their power was no longer built on women's dependence, they discovered they had no power at all. When they could no longer define themselves in opposition to weak women, they realized they had no idea who they actually were. Simone de Beauvoir died in 1986, having lived to see the beginning of the transformation she had set in motion. But her story raises questions that remain relevant today. What happens to men when women stop being their second sex? What breaks inside them when we claim our full humanity? And perhaps most importantly, what might be possible when both men and women are finally free from the prison of traditional gender roles? Conclusion. Simone de Beauvoir's story is not just about one remarkable woman's refusal to be diminished. It is about what happens when artificial hierarchies collapse, when people are forced to relate to each other as equals rather than as superior and subordinate. The men who broke under the pressure of her authenticity were casualties of a system that had taught them to build their identity on someone else's oppression. Today, as women continue to claim their full humanity in workplaces, relationships, and public life, we see the same patterns playing out. Men who have built their sense of self on being needed, being superior, being in control, often struggle when faced with women who are complete in themselves. But there is hope in this story, too. For every man who broke under the pressure of Simone's independence, there was also the possibility of growth, of evolution, of learning to love and respect women as equals rather than as possessions or complements. What do you think? Have you experienced a man breaking when you refused to be his second sex? Have you seen relationships transform when both people claimed their full humanity? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about women who changed the world by refusing to shrink themselves. And stay tuned for our next video about Virginia Woolf and the men who tried to silence her voice forever. The revolution Simone de Beauvoir started is not over. Every time a woman refuses to be anyone's second sex, she continues the work of liberation that Simone began over 70 years ago. The question is, are you ready to join her?